In the dark hours before sunrise, a quiet stretch of road in midtown Memphis looked the way it always did at that time of day: empty lanes, dim streetlights, and the kind of stillness that makes even ordinary footsteps sound loud. That's why what happened next hit so hard. Investigators would later describe surveillance video that appeared to show a woman on a run, and then a sudden violent interruption, an SUV stopping, a struggle, and the vehicle pulling away. Minutes, not hours, minutes. And yet, in those minutes, a life was taken from the people who loved her. Her name was Eliza Fletcher, known to many as Liza, a kindergarten teacher, a wife, and a mother of two. And the reason this case still sits heavy isn't only the crime itself. It's the speed at which it happened, the speed at which police say they identified a suspect, and the slower, almost unbearable, speed of another system working in the background, one that raised a painful question after the fact. Could this have been prevented? If you're new here and you value long-form true crime that stays victim-centered, sticks to what can be verified, and avoids sensationalism, consider subscribing. And stay with me to the end, because beyond the timeline and the arrest, there's one overlooked thread about evidence, delays, and accountability that helped change policy in Tennessee, and it reshapes how you understand what happened to Eliza. Before we talk about suspects in courtrooms, we have to start with Eliza as a person, because the headlines can flatten someone into a single word: victim. Eliza Fletcher was a junior kindergarten teacher at St. Mary's Episcopal School in Memphis, according to official statements about her. She was also known as an avid runner, someone who built her mornings around movement, discipline, and consistency. People close to her described a life filled with community, family, church, school, friendships. The kind of life that leaves a city full of people saying the same thing after tragedy. I didn't know her well, but I feel like I did. On Friday, September 2nd, 2022, Eliza went out for an early morning run near the University of Memphis. Reports and court summaries placed the time in the pre-dawn hours, with investigators later focusing on the area around Central Avenue. The details that follow, like exact minutes and what appeared on specific camera angles, come from law enforcement accounts and court reporting about what police said they recovered, not from speculation. And that distinction matters in true crime, because this is where rumor can fill gaps fast. We're not doing that here. Here's what is broadly confirmed by multiple reputable outlets and official statements. Eliza Fletcher was abducted during that run. She was reported missing. A large search began. A suspect was arrested within days. And tragically, Eliza was found dead a few days after she disappeared. But within days can sound almost normal, like the pace of any breaking news story. In reality, those days were chaotic, panicked, and full of small decisions that mattered. By family, by community members, by officers working the case, and by forensic labs processing evidence. The morning Eliza didn't come home, the alarm bells weren't subtle. Her run was part of her routine. The absence of someone who lives by routine is loud. When loved ones realized she hadn't returned, it escalated quickly. Memphis police, the Tennessee Bureau of Investigation, and federal partners became involved. The city's attention turned toward a simple, terrifying question: where is she? In many cases, investigators begin with the basics: confirm the last known location, try to reconstruct the last known movements, track phone data, look for witnesses. What made this case move quickly, according to reporting on the arrest affidavit, was a cluster of early pieces: a witness sighting, physical items recovered near where Eliza was last seen, and surveillance footage that police believed captured the abduction itself. One of the most talked about early details, because it's so ordinary, was what a bicyclist reportedly found later that morning: a cell phone and a pair of sandals near the area where Eliza was last seen. According to reporting based on the affidavit, those items were turned over and became part of what investigators used to build probable cause. When you hear that, it's natural to focus on the drama of the abduction. But pause on the quiet part. A random person riding a bike sees something out of place, and instead of ignoring it, they stop. In true crime, we talk a lot about key evidence. Sometimes the key evidence is only available because a stranger made a decision to pay attention. Let me ask you something here, and I'd genuinely like to read your thoughts. When a case moves fast, do you think it's usually because of one breakthrough piece of evidence, or because several small actions, witnesses, cameras, quick lab work, stack on top of each other? Drop a comment with what you think mattered most in the first 24 hours in this case: the surveillance, the phone, the sandals, or something else. From what investigators later described, surveillance footage near Central Avenue showed a dark SUV, often described in reporting as a GMC Terrain, passing through the area and then stopping, appearing to wait. The video, as summarized by outlets citing police documents, showed a struggle and then the SUV leaving with Eliza. It's difficult to overstate how disturbing that is, even when described in clinical terms. It's not only the violence, it's the setting, a public street, a familiar route, a routine run. The idea that routine can be interrupted that abruptly is part of what shook people far beyond Memphis. At this point in the timeline, there were still unknowns, big ones. Where was Eliza taken? Was she alive? Who did this and why? Investigators were under pressure, because in abduction cases, time is not just important, it can be decisive. What police did next, according to reporting, was move from the scene outward. The sandals became more than a random item. They became trace evidence. The Tennessee Bureau of Investigation lab tested them, and authorities said DNA from the sandals matched a man named Liza Fletcher, also reported in some coverage as having used the last name Henderson at times. That's a major moment in the story, and it's our first big loop closure. The identity question, at least on paper, snapped into focus quickly. But it immediately opened another loop that matters just as much. When you identify a suspect that fast, how do you prove it, and how do you find the victim in time? Police also worked the vehicle angle. A dark SUV isn't rare, but specific make and model details and location patterns narrow the field. Reporting said investigators were able to connect a GMC Terrain to Abston through a residence where he was staying, and that his phone records placed him in the area around the time of the abduction. On their own, any one of those details could be argued away. Together, they built a picture. The arrest came soon after. According to multiple reports, a U.S. Marshals task force was involved, and Abston was taken into custody. Early charges included especially aggravated kidnapping and tampering with evidence, according to reporting at the time. Even as an arrest was made, the most urgent question remained unanswered. Where was Eliza? Police said at the time that the suspect was not cooperating in providing information about her location. That meant the investigation split into two tracks, building the criminal case on paper, and searching. Physically on the ground, hour after hour. Searches expanded into areas of South Memphis, including wooded and residential spaces, based on reporting and official updates. And then, days after Eliza was abducted, authorities found her body near a vacant property. The autopsy later confirmed she died from a gunshot wound to the head, as reported by the Associated Press and other outlets. I'm stating that once clinically, because it matters to the legal record, but we're not going further than that. She was a person, not a set of details. By early September 2022, the case had shifted from missing person to homicide. That shift doesn't just change police paperwork. It changes a family's reality. It changes how a community grieves. And it changes what justice can even mean, because no outcome restores what was taken. In the immediate aftermath, people did what communities often do when words fail. They gathered. They ran. Memorial runs formed under the name Finish Liza's Run, a tribute that carried two messages at once. Remember Eliza, and confront the fear that many women live with every day while doing something as basic as going outside. That broader conversation, about safety, about public spaces, about what precautions are fair to ask of victims, can easily slip into harmful territory. So let's be explicit about something. The responsibility here belongs to the person who committed the crime. Full stop. The fact that so many women changed their routines after Eliza's death isn't evidence that women should have to live smaller lives. It's evidence that people adapt to danger even when they shouldn't have to. There's another truth that's harder to sit with. In the days after the arrest, details emerged that made the story even more unsettling, not because they were surprising, but because they were familiar in a systemic way. Liza Fletcher was not unknown to the criminal justice system. Reporting described a prior kidnapping conviction dating back to 2000, when he was a teenager, and that he had served a long prison sentence before being released in 2020. That history triggered another wave of public reaction. Questions about sentencing, release, supervision, and what rehabilitation looks like in practice. Those questions can be complicated, and it's easy for them to become political slogans. But the more meaningful way to approach them is to focus on what the record shows and what it suggests about the systems around the case. And that brings us to a second thread, one that doesn't show up in the initial missing person alerts, but became central later, a separate 2021 rape case. Here's what reputable reporting confirmed. In April 2024, a jury convicted Fletcher of raping a woman in a 2021 incident. He was later sentenced to 80 years in prison in that case, with the sentences running consecutively for multiple charges tied to that crime. This conviction was reported by the Associated Press and other outlets. The reporting also emphasized a delay. The rape kit from the 2021 case was not processed quickly, and Fletcher was not charged in that rape until after Eliza Fletcher's killing had already occurred. This is where the story becomes about more than one crime. It becomes about time, not the minutes on Central Avenue, but the months a piece of evidence can sit untested. According to reporting, The sexual assault kit from the 2021 case took many months to be processed. Officials and coverage said the DNA match that linked Abston to the 2021 rape was completed around the time Eliza's body was found. If that makes your stomach drop, you're not alone. Because it forces a question that no family should ever have to ask. If that kit had been processed sooner, would Eliza still be alive? We cannot answer that with certainty. No one can rewrite history cleanly. Even if an arrest had happened earlier, there are variables we can't control: court schedules, bond decisions, whether someone is detained, whether other crimes occur. But what we can say is this: the delay meant an opportunity for intervention may have been missed. And that possibility is what pushed this case into the policy arena. Let me pause here for a second comment question, because this is the part of the case that tends to haunt people long after the verdict. When a system delay might have contributed to a later tragedy, what accountability should look like? Should the focus be on funding labs, changing processes, leadership consequences, all of it? I'd like to know what you think the most realistic fix is. As public attention grew, Tennessee lawmakers passed legislation requiring the Tennessee Bureau of Investigation to issue quarterly reports related to sexual assault kit testing, turnaround, and staffing, changes referenced in official TBI materials as Public Chapter 249. It's one of those policy actions that can sound bureaucratic until you understand the human cost behind it. A quarterly report doesn't bring someone back, but it can force transparency. It can make it harder for backlogs to stay invisible. Back in 2022, though, none of that policy talk could soften what the Fletcher family was living through. The legal process moved forward. Abston faced charges including first-degree murder and especially aggravated kidnapping in Eliza's case, and prosecutors had indicated they would seek the death penalty if the case went to trial, according to reporting. As the months turned into years, another reality set in that's common in major cases: the slow grind of court proceedings. Motions, hearings, scheduling. The kind of procedural timeline that feels detached from grief, even though it determines how grief is carried, whether a family has to prepare for trial, whether they will hear details in open court, whether they will face appeals. In early 2024, as Abston's separate rape case went to trial and ended in conviction, the legal pressure increased. That case also highlighted the same forensic backlog issues the public was already questioning. By May 2024, he was sentenced to 80 years in prison in the 2021 rape case, again as reported by major outlets. And then, in October 2024, the central case, the one involving Eliza Fletcher, reached a decisive end. On October 28, 2024, Cleatha Abston pleaded guilty to first-degree murder and especially aggravated kidnapping in the abduction and killing of Eliza Fletcher, according to the Associated Press and official statements from the Shelby County District Attorney's Office. He was sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. Reporting also said the plea included a charge of tampering with evidence. This guilty plea meant there would be no trial, and it took the death penalty off the table. That's a huge moment in any case, and it's also where public expectations can clash. Some people hear no death penalty and think less justice. Others hear no trial and think less trauma. Neither reaction is automatically right or wrong, because they're often rooted in different ideas about what justice is supposed to do: punish, deter, protect, or acknowledge harm. But the key detail here, according to official statements, was that the resolution was made with the support of Eliza's family. That matters, not because it ends debate, but because it centers the people who have to live with the outcome. Right around here, I want to ask a third question, because it's one of the most difficult ethical tensions in true crime. When prosecutors are seeking the death penalty, but a family supports a plea that removes it, what should carry more weight: public punishment, or the family's desire for finality and fewer years of litigation? If you're comfortable sharing your view, I'm listening. If you've made it this far and you want more careful deep dives like this, a quick like helps the video reach people who care about victim-centered reporting. Now, we still need to close the loops we opened at the beginning, because the story isn't only he pleaded guilty. It's also, how did the case move so fast at first, and what did investigators rely on? In the early phase, the investigation leaned heavily on three pillars: surveillance footage, physical evidence, and digital location data. Surveillance placed a vehicle in the area, and police believed it captured the abduction. Physical evidence, most notably the sandals, provided DNA, which investigators said matched Abston. Digital evidence placed his phone in the area at the relevant time, according to reporting. And then there were behavioral details that appeared in affidavits and subsequent coverage. Allegations that a witness saw Abston cleaning the vehicle's interior with floor cleaner the day after the abduction, and that this contributed to the evidence tampering angle. It's worth noting what this combination tells you about modern investigations. Solving a case quickly isn't magic. It's infrastructure: cameras mounted on buildings, lab capacity, databases that can compare DNA, cell phone records that can be subpoenaed, agencies that cooperate. When one of those pieces is missing or delayed, the outcome can change. That's why the rape kit backlog thread isn't just an extra detail. It's the mirror image of the quick DNA match in Eliza's case. In one context, DNA moved fast enough to identify a suspect within days. In another context, DNA moved so slowly that a suspect remained free for months after an alleged rape. Same technology, different timeline, different consequences. This is also the moment where true crime storytelling can go wrong, by turning policy into a neat moral lesson like everything happened for a reason. Real life is not that tidy. Eliza Fletcher's death is not a lesson. It's a loss. The best we can do is ask whether systems can reduce the chances of another family living through something similar. In the years after the murder, reports indicated that Tennessee's processing times for sexual assault kits improved compared to what they were in 2022, and that the state added resources and reporting requirements. Those improvements are meaningful, but they also underline something uncomfortable. Backlogs are often treated as acceptable until a high-profile case forces them into public view. That pattern is not unique to Tennessee. Across the United States, rape kit backlogs have been documented for years. Many advocates have argued that kits represent not just evidence, but a promise to survivors that their cases matter. When a kit sits untested, it communicates the opposite. And when a kit is tested late, it can still produce justice, but it can also arrive after damage has multiplied. The fourth question I want to put to you is about that broader truth. How should the public measure whether reforms are real? Is it faster testing times alone, more staffing, better tracking, more prosecutions, or something else entirely? Now let's return briefly to Eliza, because the legal outcome, even when it's final, can dominate the narrative and drown out the person at the center of it. Eliza Fletcher was 34 years old. She had a husband, 2 young sons, students who knew her as Mrs. Fletcher, a school community that had to explain a tragedy to children who were too young to understand why adults sometimes don't come back. The kind of grief that shows up later in ordinary moments, at drop-off lines, at holiday concerts, at the start of a school year. When Abston pleaded guilty in 2024, it closed one kind of uncertainty, the courtroom uncertainty. But it didn't close the emotional uncertainty. Families often describe a strange emptiness after sentencing, because the years of waiting become their own routine. When the waiting ends, the absence remains. It's also important to say clearly what is and isn't known about motive. In some cases, motive is spelled out through confession, testimony, or a documented relationship. In this case, the reporting that followed the guilty plea focused more on the legal resolution than on a detailed motive narrative. The absence of a clear, publicly explained motive can be destabilizing, because people want a reason they can understand, something that makes the world feel more predictable. But sometimes there isn't a reason that satisfies. Sometimes the reality is simply that a person chose violence, and the rest of us are left trying to rebuild a sense of safety. That's where the community response becomes part of the story. Finish Liza's Run wasn't only memorializing. It was a way to refuse the shrinking of public life. A way to say, we will remember her, and we will also keep moving forward in the spaces where fear tries to take over. If you're watching this and you're a runner, or you love someone who runs, you probably felt something in your chest during the early timeline. Not because you think the same thing will happen to you, but because you realize it could. And that awareness is heavy. It can make people change routes, change times, change habits, buy new gear, stop going alone. And while practical safety choices can be reasonable, it's also okay to name the grief underneath them. It's unfair to have to carry that calculation at all. So what do we do with a case like this, years later, after the plea, after the sentence? We tell it carefully. We tell it in a way that honors the victim, respects the family, and doesn't turn violence into entertainment. We focus on what can be verified. We acknowledge what remains unknown. And we pay attention to the systems that shape the timeline, not to excuse anything, but to understand how prevention might work in the real world. Here's what we know, in the most grounded terms. Eliza Fletcher was abducted during a morning run in Memphis on September 2, 2022. Authorities said surveillance footage, physical evidence, and phone location data helped identify Cletha Abston as a suspect quickly. Eliza was found dead days later. An autopsy confirmed she died from a gunshot wound to the head. Abston later pleaded guilty to first-degree murder and especially aggravated kidnapping, and was sentenced to life without parole. Separately, he was convicted and sentenced in a 2021 rape case, and that case drew attention to delays in sexual assault kit processing. Tennessee responded with reporting requirements and resource efforts aimed at improving turnaround times. And here is what remains unknowable to the public unless it's ever disclosed in detail. The full sequence of events in the time between the abduction and the recovery of Eliza's body, including private facts that the family should never have to see turned into content. The end of this story, the part one asked you to stay for, was never going to be a twist. It's an insight. The same modern tools that helped identify a suspect within days in Eliza's case are only as effective as the systems that process them. When the system works quickly, it can stop someone. When it works slowly, it can leave people exposed. That doesn't mean every tragedy is preventable, but it does mean delays aren't neutral. They carry weight. They create risk. They can become the difference between intervention and aftermath. If you take anything from this case, let it be this. Behind every backlog headline are real people waiting for action, and behind every policy change is a story that cost more than it should have. Eliza Fletcher should be remembered as more than the way she died. She should be remembered as a teacher who shaped little lives, as a mother whose children deserved more time with her, and as a person whose ordinary morning routine became the focus of a city's grief. And if you're still here at the end, thank you for staying with a hard story in a respectful way. If you want more long-form investigations that prioritize accuracy, context, and dignity, consider subscribing. And if you'd like, watch another case with a similar systemic question next, because sometimes the only way change happens is when people refuse to look away.